The gunshot echoed through the canyon just as Hannah Olsen pressed her back against the sun-warmed rock, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She had been running for 3 days straight, her boots worn through at the heels, her dress torn and dusty. And now she could hear the horses coming closer through the scrub brush of the Utah desert. It was September of 1878, and she had exactly 2 choices: surrender to the men who wanted her dead for witnessing a murder in Silver City, or keep running until her legs gave out completely. She chose to run. The hill rose before her like a promise, steep and covered with sage and juniper, and Hannah scrambled up it with the last reserves of her strength. Her fingers bled as she grabbed at rocks and roots, pulling herself higher and higher as the voices below grew louder. They were arguing about which direction she had gone, and Hannah used their confusion to push herself over the crest of the hill and down the other side, where she found herself staring at a small valley, dotted with cattle, and a distant ranch house that looked like salvation painted in weathered wood. She did not make it to the ranch house. Her legs simply stopped working halfway down the hill, and Hannah collapsed in a heap behind a cluster of scrub oak, her breath coming in ragged gasps that hurt her chest. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and she thought dimly that it was a beautiful evening to die. She could still hear the men searching, their horses moving through the brush with the sound of breaking branches and frustrated curses. Hannah closed her eyes and tried to make herself as small as possible, curling into a ball behind the oak trees and praying they would not find her. She thought of her father, who had died of fever 2 years ago in Parowan. She thought of her mother, who had followed him 6 months later, leaving Hannah alone in a world that seemed determined to grind her into dust. She had been working as a seamstress in Silver City when she saw Frank Holloway shoot a man in cold blood over a card game. And now, Frank and his brothers were hunting her across the Utah Territory to make sure she could never testify. The voices faded eventually, moving back toward the canyon, and Hannah allowed herself to breathe again. She was thirsty beyond measure, her lips cracked and bleeding, and she knew she could not stay where she was. When darkness fell completely, she would try to reach that ranch house and beg for help. Surely someone there would have mercy on a woman alone. But as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Hannah found she could not move. Her body had reached its limit, and even the thought of standing made her want to weep. So she lay there behind the scrub oak and watched the stars appear one by one, brilliant and cold and impossibly distant. She had always loved the stars, ever since she was a little girl in Parowan, and her father would take her outside on clear nights to point out the constellations. The Big Dipper hung low in the northern sky, and Hannah traced its outline with her eyes, remembering her father's warm hand on her shoulder as he taught her to find the North Star. She wondered if he could see her now, if he knew how badly she had failed at staying alive in this harsh world he had left her in. She did not hear the footsteps until they were very close. Hannah's eyes flew open and she tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and gave out. A shadow fell across her, tall and broad-shouldered, and she opened her mouth to scream, but only a dry croak emerged. "Easy now," a deep voice said, surprisingly gentle. "I am not going to hurt you." The man crouched down beside her, and in the starlight, Hannah could make out a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, dark eyes that studied her with concern rather than malice. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a vest over a faded blue shirt, and a bandana tied around his neck. His hands, she noticed, were steady and calloused as he reached for the canteen on his belt. "You look like you have been running from something," he said, uncapping the canteen. "Can you drink?" Hannah nodded weakly, and he slipped one arm behind her shoulders, lifting her gently so she could sip from the canteen. The water was warm and tasted like leather, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever experienced. She drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Not too much at once," he said. "You will make yourself sick." "They are looking for me," Hannah managed to whisper, her voice raw. "Men with guns." The cowboy's expression hardened. "I heard them earlier, riding through my land like they owned it. They are gone now, headed back toward the canyon. Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Hannah shook her head, and to her horror, tears began to spill down her cheeks. She had not cried once during her 3 days of running, had not allowed herself that weakness, but now in the presence of kindness she found she could not stop. "I have nowhere," she said. "They will kill me if they find me." The cowboy was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face in the starlight. Then he made a decision. "My name is Thomas McAllister. I run cattle on this land with my brother. Our ranch is just down the hill. You can stay there tonight, get cleaned up and fed, and tomorrow we will figure out what to do about these men." "Why would you help me?" Hannah asked. "You do not even know me." Thomas looked up at the stars, then back down at her. "Because someone helped my mother once, when my father died and left her with 2 young boys and no money. A stranger gave her work and a place to stay until she could get back on her feet. I figure I owe that kindness to the world." He stood and held out his hand to her. Hannah stared at it for a moment, this calloused hand offered in friendship, and then she took it. Thomas pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, and when her legs wobbled, he simply swept her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. "I can walk," Hannah protested weakly. "Maybe you can," Thomas agreed, "but you do not have to." He carried her down the hill as the stars blazed overhead, and Hannah found herself staring at his profile in the darkness. He had a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He could not have been much older than she was, perhaps 25 to her 22 years, and there was something steady about him that made her feel safe for the first time in days. The ranch house was larger than it had looked from the hill, a sturdy structure with a wide porch and warm light glowing in the windows. Thomas carried her up the steps and kicked the door open with his boot, calling out as he entered, "Daniel, get the spare room ready. We have a guest." A younger man appeared from a doorway, similar in build to Thomas but with lighter hair and a more open expression. His eyes widened when he saw Hannah in his brother's arms. "What happened?" Daniel asked. "She has been running from some men," Thomas said. "The ones we heard riding through earlier. She needs food, water, and a safe place to sleep." Daniel nodded without hesitation. "I will get the room ready and heat some water for washing. There is stew left from supper." Thomas carried Hannah into a small bedroom off the main living area and set her down carefully on the bed. It was a simple room, clean and spare, with a washstand and a window that looked out over the dark valley. Hannah sank onto the mattress and felt her entire body sag with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "You are safe here. No one is going to hurt you under this roof. I give you my word." Over the next hour, Hannah found herself cared for with an efficiency that spoke of 2 men long accustomed to managing on their own. Daniel brought in a basin of warm water and clean cloths, along with one of his shirts that would serve as a nightgown. Thomas returned with a bowl of beef stew and fresh bread and sat patiently while Hannah ate every bite, even though her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the spoon. "Can you tell me what happened?" Thomas asked when she had finished eating. "Who are these men?" Hannah set down the bowl and wrapped her arms around herself. I was working as a seamstress in Silver City. 3 weeks ago, I was walking home late from a client's house, and I saw a man named Frank Holloway shoot another man in an argument over cards. Frank saw me see it. He came after me and I ran. I have been running ever since. Frank Holloway, Thomas repeated, his expression darkening. I know that name. He runs with a rough crowd, him and his brothers. They have been causing trouble all over the territory. He will not stop looking for me, Hannah said quietly. He cannot afford to let me testify. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Then we will not let him find you. You can stay here as long as you need to. We could use help around the ranch anyway. Daniel and I have more work than we can handle with just the two of us. I cannot ask you to put yourselves in danger for me, Hannah protested. You did not ask, Thomas pointed out. I offered. There is a difference. He stood and walked to the door, then paused and looked back at her. Get some rest. Tomorrow we will figure out a plan, and Hannah, you are not alone anymore. After he left, Hannah lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning. She should leave. She should slip out in the night and keep running, lead the danger away from these kind men who had taken her in. But her body refused to cooperate, exhaustion pulling her down into darkness, and within minutes she was asleep. She woke once during the night, disoriented and frightened, and heard the low murmur of voices from the main room. Thomas and Daniel talking quietly. She caught fragments of their conversation. We cannot just hand her over, Daniel was saying. I know, Thomas replied. We will not. But we need to be smart about this. Frank Holloway is not a man to take lightly. You like her, Daniel said, and there was something knowing in his voice. A long pause. I do not even know her. That has never stopped you from making up your mind about someone. I saw how you carried her in here, Tom, like she was made of glass. She has been through hell. Anyone would be gentle with her. Sure, Daniel said, clearly unconvinced. Whatever you say. Hannah closed her eyes and felt something warm unfold in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing, that Thomas was simply a decent man helping someone in need. But she could not deny that she felt drawn to him in a way she had not expected, that his presence made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father died. The morning came bright and hot, as September mornings in Utah tended to be. Hannah woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and found clean clothes laid out on the chair by her bed. They were men's clothes, trousers and a shirt, and she put them on gratefully, rolling up the sleeves and cinching the pants with a piece of rope that had been thoughtfully provided. Her dress had been beyond saving, torn and filthy from her days of running. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Thomas at the stove, cooking breakfast with the easy competence of someone who had been doing it for years. He looked up when she entered and smiled, and Hannah felt that warmth in her chest again. Morning, he said. How do you feel? Sore, Hannah admitted, but better, thank you for the clothes. They fit well enough, Thomas observed. Daniel has gone out to check the cattle, come eat. They sat at the rough wooden table, and Hannah ate scrambled eggs and bacon while Thomas drank coffee and watched her with those dark, thoughtful eyes. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, all sharp angles and tanned skin, with hands that looked capable of anything from gentling a horse to building a house. There was a scar on his chin that she found herself wanting to ask about. We need to talk about what to do, Thomas said finally. Frank Holloway and his brothers will not give up easily, but running forever is not a solution either. What other choice do I have? Hannah asked. If I go to the law, they will want me to testify and Frank will kill me before I can. Not if we make sure the law gets Frank first, Thomas said. There is a U.S. Marshal in Parowan, a man named Jacob Stone. He is honest, which is rare enough, and he has been trying to catch Frank Holloway for months. If we can get word to him about what you saw, he might be able to move fast enough to arrest Frank before he knows what is happening." Hannah considered this. And if he cannot, if Frank finds out and comes here, Thomas's expression was calm but resolute. "Then Daniel and I will handle it. We are not killers, Hannah, but we know how to defend our land and our own." "I do not want anyone to die because of me," Hannah said quietly. "No one is going to die," Thomas assured her, "but we need to be smart. For now, you stay here and help around the ranch. Keep your head down. I will ride to Parowan tomorrow and talk to Marshal Stone." Over the following days, Hannah found herself settling into life on the McAllister ranch in a way she had not expected. The work was hard physical labor that left her exhausted by nightfall, but it was honest work, and she found satisfaction in it. She helped Daniel with the cooking and cleaning, mended clothes with her seamstress skills, and even learned to help with some of the lighter ranch chores like feeding the chickens and tending the small vegetable garden behind the house. Thomas rode to Parowan and returned 2 days later with news that Marshal Stone was very interested in Hannah's testimony. The marshal had promised to investigate quietly, to build a case against Frank Holloway without alerting him that they had a witness. It would take time, he said, possibly weeks, but he was confident he could make an arrest. In the meantime, Hannah was to stay hidden at the ranch. Those weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended time. Hannah woke each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee, worked through the hot desert days, and fell into bed each night too tired to dream. But through it all, she became increasingly aware of Thomas in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. She noticed how he was always the first one up, starting the coffee before dawn so it would be ready when Daniel woke. She noticed how he was patient with the horses, speaking to them in a low, gentle voice that made them calm and trusting. She noticed how he sometimes stood on the porch at night and looked up at the stars, his expression distant and thoughtful, as though he was searching for answers in the wheeling constellations. And she noticed how he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his dark eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her heart race. It was Daniel who finally said something about it. "My brother is in love with you," he announced one afternoon while they were shelling peas on the porch. Thomas had ridden out to check on the cattle in the far pasture and would not be back until evening. Hannah's hand stilled. "He barely knows me." "Thomas does not need long to make up his mind about things," Daniel said with a shrug. "He is like that. When he was 15, he decided we should move to Utah and start a ranch. Took him 2 years to save the money and make it happen, but he never wavered. When he sets his mind on something, that is it." "I am not a ranch," Hannah pointed out, trying to keep her voice light. "No," Daniel agreed, "but you are something he has decided is worth fighting for. I see it in how he looks at you, how he makes sure you have eaten before he sits down, how he always positions himself between you and the door, like he is ready to defend you at any moment." Hannah's throat felt tight. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything to me," Daniel said, "but you might want to think about what you feel. Because when Marshal Stone arrests Frank Holloway, you will be free to go wherever you want, and I think my brother is going to ask you to stay." That night, Hannah could not sleep. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about Thomas and the way he made her feel. It was not just gratitude, though there was certainly that. It was something deeper, something that had been growing steadily over the weeks she had spent on the ranch. She found herself thinking about him constantly, wondering what he was doing when he was out on the range, looking forward to the evenings when they all sat on the porch and talked while the sun set. She thought about the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face, making him look younger and more carefree. She thought about his hands, strong and capable, and wondered what they would feel like holding hers. She thought about his voice, low and steady, and how safe it made her feel. She was falling in love with him, Hannah realized. Perhaps had already fallen. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Unable to lie still any longer, Hannah got up and pulled on a shawl over her nightgown. She slipped out of her bedroom and through the quiet house, opening the front door as silently as she could. The night was cool and clear, the sky brilliant with stars, and Hannah found herself drawn to the hill behind the ranch house, the same hill where Thomas had found her that first night. She climbed it slowly, her bare feet finding purchase on the familiar path, until she reached the top where the view opened up across the entire valley. The ranch house was a small square of light below, and beyond it, the dark land stretched away to distant mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. Hannah sat down in the grass and tipped her head back, losing herself in the vastness above. The Milky Way spread across the sky like a river of light, and she could pick out the constellations her father had taught her. Cassiopeia and Cygnus, Lyra and Aquila. The stars had always made her feel small in the best possible way, reminded her that her troubles were tiny things in the grand scope of the universe. She did not hear Thomas approaching until he was already sitting down beside her in the grass. Hannah started slightly, then relaxed when she saw who it was. "I did not mean to wake you." "You did not," Thomas said. "I could not sleep either. I saw you heading up the hill and thought I would make sure you were all right." They sat in silence for a moment, both looking up at the stars. Hannah was intensely aware of how close he was, their shoulders almost touching. She could feel the warmth of his body in the cool night air. "I used to do this with my father," Hannah said softly. "Go out at night to look at the stars. He knew all the constellations, could tell you the stories behind them. I always felt like I could tell him anything under these stars, like the darkness and the distance made it safe to speak the truth." "What would you tell him now?" Thomas asked. "If he was here?" Hannah considered the question. "I would tell him that I am scared. Not of Frank Holloway anymore, strangely enough. Marshal Stone sent word yesterday that he is close to making an arrest. No, I am scared of what happens after. I have no home to return to, no family left. I do not know where I will go or what I will do." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to look at her, and even in the starlight she could see the intensity in his eyes. "You could stay here," he said. Hannah's breath caught. "Thomas." "I know it is fast," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "I know we have only known each other a few weeks. But Hannah, from the moment I found you on this hill, something in me recognized something in you, like we were meant to find each other. I have never felt this way about anyone." "I feel it too," Hannah whispered. "I have been trying to tell myself it is just gratitude, just the circumstance of how we met, but it is more than that, so much more." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with infinite gentleness. "Then stay. Help us run the ranch, build a life here. Let me court you properly, the way you deserve. And maybe, if you come to care for me the way I care for you, maybe someday we could be more." Hannah looked down at their joined hands, her heart hammering in her chest. "I already care for you," she said. "More than I should, probably, given how short a time it has been. But Daniel was right. You have a way of making up your mind about things quickly, and apparently that is contagious." Thomas laughed, a rare sound that made her smile. "Daniel talks too much. He cares about you," Hannah said. "He wants you to be happy." "I am happy when I am with you," Thomas said simply. Then he reached up with his free hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You are like these stars, Hannah, bright and beautiful and constant. When everything else is dark and uncertain, you are there, steady and true." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple poetry of his words. That might be the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me." Thomas shifted closer, his dark eyes searching her face. "I mean every word. You are my brightest star, Hannah Olsen. And if you will let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Hannah could not speak past the lump in her throat, so instead she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft and sweet, tasting of starlight and promises, and when Thomas pulled her closer she went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck and losing herself in the feeling of being held, being wanted, being cherished. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a hint of humor in his voice. "That is a yes," Hannah confirmed and kissed him again. They stayed on the hill for hours, lying side by side in the grass and talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Thomas told her about growing up in Missouri, about how his father had died when he was 13, and his mother had worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for him and Daniel. He told her about the stranger who had given them a chance, a rancher who had hired his mother as a cook and let them live in a cabin on his land until she could save enough money to buy their own small place. "She died 5 years ago," Thomas said quietly. "Heart just gave out one day. I think she worked herself to death, honestly, but she made sure Daniel and I had skills, had a future. Everything we have now we owe to her." "She sounds like an amazing woman," Hannah said. "She would have liked you," Thomas replied. "She always said I needed someone who could match my stubborn streak, someone who would not back down when things got hard. I think you might be that person." Hannah told him about her own parents, about growing up in Parowan as the only child of a carpenter and his wife. She told him about learning to sew from her mother, about the quiet evenings spent reading while her father worked on his projects. She told him about the fever that had taken her father and the grief that had taken her mother, leaving her alone in a world that suddenly seemed too big and too cruel. "I was so lost," she admitted. "I went to Silver City because I heard there was work for seamstresses, but I never felt at home there. I was just existing, just going through the motions. And then I saw Frank kill that man, and suddenly I was running for my life, and everything that had seemed important before just fell away. All I wanted was to survive." "And now?" Thomas asked. "Now I want to live," Hannah said. "Really live, build something that matters. And I want to do it here with you." Thomas turned on his side to face her, propping himself up on one elbow. "I am going to do everything in my power to make you happy, Hannah. I promise you that." "You already do," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "Just by being who you are." As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they made their way back down the hill hand in hand. Daniel was already up, starting breakfast, and he took one look at their joined hands and intertwined fingers and grinned. "About time," was all he said, but his eyes were warm with approval. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Hannah and Thomas were careful to maintain propriety, conscious of appearances, but they found time to be alone together when they could. They took walks in the evening after the work was done, rode out together to check on the cattle, sat close on the porch while Daniel played his harmonica and the stars wheeled overhead. Hannah felt herself falling deeper in love with every passing day. She loved the way Thomas was always thinking, always planning for the future. She loved how he treated his brother with affection and respect, never pulling rank despite being the older one. She loved his quiet strength, the way he could calm a skittish horse or fix a broken fence post with equal competence. And she loved the way he looked at her, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. Thomas, for his part, seemed equally smitten. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow, made sure she had the best cut of meat at dinner, taught her to ride properly so she could help move the cattle. And at night, when they sat together under the stars, he would tell her stories about the ranch, about his dreams of building something lasting, something that would endure. "I want to have a family here someday," he told her one evening. "Children who will grow up knowing the land, understanding how to care for it. I want to build a legacy." "That sounds wonderful," Hannah said softly, leaning against his shoulder. "I want to build it with you," Thomas clarified, turning to look at her. "I know it is too soon to talk about marriage, but I want you to know that is where my mind is going. That is what I see when I think about the future." Hannah's heart swelled. "I see the same thing." Word came from Marshal Stone on a bright October morning. He had arrested Frank Holloway and his brothers outside of Cedar City, catching them in the act of rustling cattle. With Hannah's testimony about the murder in Silver City, plus the evidence of their other crimes, the marshal was confident they would hang or spend the rest of their lives in prison. Hannah was needed in Parowan to give her official statement. Thomas insisted on riding with her, and Daniel stayed behind to mind the ranch. The journey to Parowan took most of a day, and Hannah found herself growing nervous as they approached the town where she had grown up. It looked smaller than she remembered, dustier. But the mountains in the distance were just as impressive, and the air had that crisp autumn clarity she had always loved. Marshal Stone was a grizzled man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He took Hannah's statement carefully, asking detailed questions about what she had seen that night in Silver City. Hannah answered as completely as she could, her voice steady, even though her hands shook slightly as she relived the memory. "You are a brave woman," the marshal said when she was finished. "Frank Holloway is a dangerous man, and you stood up to him. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." "I just want him locked away," Hannah said, "so no one else gets hurt." "He will be," Marshal Stone assured her. "You have my word on that." They stayed in Parowan that night, Thomas getting them separate rooms at the hotel with a propriety that made Hannah both grateful and slightly disappointed. But when he walked her to her door and kissed her good night, gentle and sweet, she felt nothing but contentment. "Tomorrow we go home," Thomas said softly. "Back to the ranch, back to our life." "Our life," Hannah repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." They rode back to the ranch the next day, arriving just as the sun was setting. Daniel had kept everything running smoothly in their absence, and he greeted them with the news that 3 of the cows had given birth while they were gone. "We are going to have a good year," Daniel said with satisfaction. "The herd is growing, the grass is good, and beef prices are up. We might actually make a real profit this year." "We should celebrate," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that made Hannah look at him sharply. That evening, after a dinner of roasted chicken and potatoes, Thomas asked Hannah to walk with him. They climbed the hill behind the house, the same hill where he had found her that first desperate night, the same hill where they had confessed their feelings under the stars. The sun had set, but the sky was still painted in shades of purple and gold, and the first stars were beginning to emerge. Thomas stopped at the top of the hill and turned to face Hannah, taking both her hands in his. "I have been thinking about this for weeks," he said. "Probably should have thought about it longer, given the timing, but I have never been good at waiting when I know what I want." Hannah's heart began to race. "Thomas." He dropped to one knee in the grass, still holding her hands, and looked up at her with those dark, earnest eyes. "Hannah Olsen, I know we have only known each other for 2 months. I know this is fast by any reasonable standard. But I also know that you are the person I want to wake up next to every morning for the rest of my life. You are smart and strong and brave, and you make me want to be better than I am. Will you marry me?" Hannah felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling so hard her face hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Thomas stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, he pulled a ring from his pocket. It was simple, a thin gold band with a small chip of turquoise set in it. "It was my mother's," Thomas said as he slipped it onto her finger. "She would have wanted you to have it." Hannah looked down at the ring, at the way it caught the last light of the setting sun, and felt overwhelmed with emotion. "It is perfect. You are perfect. All of this is perfect." They sat down in the grass and Thomas pulled her close, and Hannah rested her head on his shoulder as the stars came out one by one above them. The Big Dipper hung in the north, just as it had the first night, but everything else had changed. She was no longer alone and running, no longer desperate and afraid. She had found a home, a family, a future. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked softly. "That I never imagined being this happy," Hannah said honestly. "When I was running through the desert, half dead from thirst and exhaustion, I could not have dreamed that I would end up here, with you." "I am glad I found you that night," Thomas said. "Glad you were brave enough to keep running until you reached my land. Glad you gave me the chance to know you." "I am glad for all of it too," Hannah said. "Even the hard parts, because they led me here." They were married 3 weeks later in Parowan, with Marshall Stone serving as one of the witnesses and Daniel as the best man. Hannah wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Thomas had bought in town, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Thomas wore his best suit, which he admitted he had only worn twice before, and looked so handsome that Hannah could barely breathe when she saw him standing at the front of the small church. The ceremony was simple and brief, conducted by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through town. Hannah spoke her vows in a clear voice, promising to love and cherish Thomas for as long as they both lived. Thomas's voice was rougher, emotion making it crack slightly, but his words were firm and sure. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Hannah with a tenderness that made her forget there were other people in the room. Daniel whooped, and Marshall Stone applauded, and Hannah felt happiness bubble up inside her like champagne. They had a small celebration dinner at the hotel, just the 4 of them, and then Daniel tactfully announced he had business to attend to and would see them back at the ranch in a few days. Marshall Stone also made his excuses, and suddenly Hannah and Thomas were alone, walking back to their hotel room as husband and wife. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as they climbed the stairs. "A little," Hannah admitted, "but mostly I am just happy." Thomas unlocked the door and carried her over the threshold, making her laugh with delight. He set her down gently and then kissed her again, deep and slow, his hands tangling in her hair. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I have loved you since that first night on the hill, when you looked at me with those brave eyes and trusted me to keep you safe." "I love you too," Hannah whispered back, "with everything I am." They made love for the first time as husband and wife, tender and passionate, discovering each other with gentle hands and whispered words. Hannah had been nervous about this part, having no experience and only vague ideas of what to expect. But Thomas was patient and careful, making sure she was comfortable every step of the way. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, the moonlight streaming through the window and painting silver patterns on the walls. Thomas traced lazy circles on Hannah's shoulder with his fingertips, and she felt completely, utterly content. "This is just the beginning," Thomas said softly. "We have our whole lives ahead of us." "I cannot wait," Hannah replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, and Hannah officially moved her few belongings from the spare room into Thomas's bedroom. It felt momentous and ordinary at the same time, this claiming of space and life together. Daniel had cleaned the whole house in their absence and left wildflowers in jars on every surface, which made Hannah tear up with affection for her new brother-in-law. "Welcome home, sister," Daniel said with a grin and hugged her tight. The winter passed quickly, a blur of hard work and quiet contentment. Hannah threw herself into learning everything she could about ranching until she could rope a calf and brand cattle alongside the men. She also continued her sewing, taking on commissions from the women in Parowan who had heard about her skill with a needle. The extra money was helpful, and she enjoyed the creative outlet. Thomas proved to be everything Hannah had hoped for in a husband and more. He was patient when she made mistakes learning ranch work, affectionate without being overbearing, and deeply committed to building a life together. They talked about everything, from their dreams for expanding the ranch to whether they wanted children right away or should wait a few years. "I want to wait a little while," Hannah said one evening as they lay in bed. "Not forever, but maybe a year or two. I want it to be just us for a while, so we can really build our foundation as a couple." "That sounds wise," Thomas agreed, pulling her closer. "Besides, Daniel would probably spoil any children rotten anyway. He needs some time to prepare himself for the responsibility." Hannah laughed. "He would be a wonderful uncle." "He would," Thomas agreed fondly. Spring came with a riot of wildflowers across the meadows, and Hannah found herself falling in love with the land as much as she had fallen in love with Thomas. She understood now why he had chosen this place, why he fought to build something lasting here. There was a beauty to the high desert that was harsh and unforgiving but also breathtaking, a landscape that demanded respect and rewarded those who were willing to work for it. Marshal Stone sent word in April that Frank Holloway and his brothers had been tried and sentenced to hang. The execution would take place in Silver City in 2 weeks if Hannah wanted to attend. She thought about it for a long time, discussed it with Thomas late into the night. Part of her wanted to see justice served, to watch the man who had terrorized her meet his end. But another part of her, the part that had found peace and happiness on this ranch, did not want to give Frank Holloway another moment of her time or attention. "I do not need to see him hang," she said finally. "I know he will face consequences for what he did. That is enough for me. I would rather stay here and focus on our life, on building our future, than dwell on the past." "I think that is a healthy choice," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. "The past is done. We get to decide what comes next." What came next was a summer of hard work and growth. The ranch prospered, the cattle herd growing larger and healthier than it had been in years. Thomas and Daniel talked about buying more land, expanding their operation, and Hannah threw herself into planning what that would look like. She had discovered she had a head for numbers and organization, and she began keeping detailed records of expenses and income, tracking trends and identifying areas where they could improve efficiency. "You are a natural at this," Thomas said one evening, looking over her neat columns of figures. "We should have put you in charge of the books years ago." "You did not know me years ago," Hannah pointed out with a smile. "Fair point," Thomas conceded and kissed the top of her head. They celebrated their first anniversary on a warm October evening, riding out to a high meadow where they could see for miles in every direction. Thomas had packed a picnic, cold chicken and fresh bread and apple pie, and they ate while the sun set in a blaze of orange and red. "1 year," Hannah said, marveling at how fast the time had gone. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Thomas agreed. "I cannot remember what my life was like before you, but at the same time it feels like you have always been here. Do you ever regret it?" Hannah asked. "Moving so fast, marrying someone you barely knew," Thomas turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Never, not once. You are the best decision I ever made, Hannah McAllister." She leaned over and kissed him, tasting apple pie and love. "You are mine, too." That night, as they lay in bed, Thomas brought up the subject of children again. "I know we said we would wait," he began carefully, "and I am happy to keep waiting if that is what you want. But I have been thinking lately about how much I want to be a father. How much I want to see you with our child. If you are ready, I would like to start trying." Hannah had been thinking about the same thing, truth be told. She felt settled now, secure in her marriage and her place on the ranch. She was not the desperate, frightened woman who had stumbled onto this land a year ago. She was strong and capable, ready to take on new challenges. "I think I am ready," she said softly. "I want to have your children, Thomas. I want to build that family you talked about." Thomas's smile was brilliant in the darkness, and he kissed her with a passion that made her head spin. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. "Thank you for choosing this life with me." It took 6 months for Hannah to conceive, 6 months of hoping and occasional disappointment when her monthly courses arrived. But in April of 1880, she woke up feeling nauseated and tired, and by May she was certain. The midwife in Parowan confirmed her suspicions. She was pregnant, due sometime in late December or early January. Thomas was overjoyed when she told him, picking her up and spinning her around despite her protests that he would make her sick. Daniel was equally excited, already making plans for how they would need to set up a nursery and baby-proof the house. "You two are going to be insufferable for the next 7 months, are you not?" Hannah said, but she was smiling. "Absolutely," Thomas confirmed cheerfully. "Deal with it." The pregnancy was mostly easy, though Hannah found she tired quickly and had to adjust her work schedule accordingly. Thomas was almost comically protective, constantly fussing over whether she was eating enough, resting enough, staying out of the hot sun. Hannah found it both endearing and mildly frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of porcelain," she pointed out after he tried to stop her from lifting a basket of laundry. "Women have been doing this for thousands of years." "Not my wife carrying my child," Thomas countered. "This is unprecedented." Daniel, listening to this exchange from across the room, rolled his eyes. "You are doomed, Hannah. He is going to be like this until the baby is 18. "Probably longer," Thomas admitted without shame. As Hannah's belly grew round with their child, she found herself thinking often about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. If she had not witnessed that murder in Silver City, if Frank Holloway had not chased her across the territory, if she had not collapsed on that hill on Thomas's land that particular night, none of this would have happened. She would not have found love, would not have found home, would not be preparing to bring a new life into the world. It was strange how the worst moments of her life had led to the best ones. The baby came on a cold January night during a snowstorm that blanketed the valley in white. Hannah's labor started just after supper, sharp pains that took her breath away. Thomas immediately sent Daniel racing to Parowan to fetch the midwife, then focused all his attention on Hannah, helping her through each contraction with steady hands and calm words. "You are doing so well," he kept saying. "You are so strong. I am right here." The midwife arrived a few hours later, snow dusting her cloak, and took charge with the confidence of someone who had delivered hundreds of babies. She examined Hannah, pronounced everything normal, and settled in for what she said would probably be a long night. She was right. Hannah labored through the night and into the early hours of the morning, exhausted and hurting but determined. Thomas never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, breathing with her through the worst of the pains. Finally, as the sun began to rise over the snow-covered valley, Hannah gave one last tremendous push, and their baby entered the world with a loud, indignant cry. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, holding up the squalling infant. A healthy boy. Hannah collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as the midwife cleaned the baby and placed him in her arms. He was tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be brown like his father's. Thomas leaned over them both, his own eyes wet with tears, and touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger. The infant immediately grabbed hold, wrapping his whole fist around Thomas's finger with surprising strength. "Hello, son," Thomas said softly. "Welcome to the world. What should we name him?" Hannah asked, unable to look away from her baby's face. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Thomas said, "James, after your father, James Daniel McAllister." Hannah looked up at him, fresh tears spilling over. "You would do that, name him after my father." "He raised the woman I love," Thomas said simply. "I wish I could have met him. This way he is part of our family." "James Daniel McAllister," Hannah repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect." Daniel was thrilled to have a nephew bearing his middle name, and proved to be exactly as doting an uncle as they had predicted. He carved toys for the baby, sang lullabies in his terrible singing voice, and volunteered for diaper duty with a frequency that surprised everyone. "I like him," Daniel said simply when Thomas questioned his enthusiasm. "He is family." The next few years passed in a blur of sleepless nights and baby milestones. James was a happy child, quick to smile and curious about everything. He took his first steps on the porch of the ranch house, walked straight into Thomas's waiting arms. His first word was "da," which made Thomas insufferably smug for weeks. He was talking in full sentences by the time he was 2, and by 3 he was following Thomas and Daniel around the ranch like a shadow, wanting to help with everything. Hannah watched her son grow with a mixture of pride and wonder, marveling at how this little person had come from her and Thomas. She loved being a mother, loved the cuddles and the laughter, and even the difficult moments. But she also made sure to maintain her own identity, continuing to keep the ranch books and take sewing commissions when she had time. "You are an amazing mother," Thomas told her one evening as they watched James sleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. "But you are also still you. I love that about you." "I love you," Hannah said simply, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you for building this life with me." When James was 3, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with more nausea and fatigue, but she made it through with Thomas's constant support. Their daughter was born in August of 1884, a beautiful baby with Hannah's light hair and Thomas's dark eyes. They named her Margaret Rose, and she was every bit as strong-willed as her mother. Where James had been an easy baby, Margaret was demanding, wanting to be held constantly and crying if she did not get her way. But she was also deeply affectionate, cuddling close and giving sloppy kisses with abandon. "She is going to keep us on our toes," Thomas said with a mixture of exhaustion and delight after a particularly trying night when Margaret refused to sleep. "She certainly is," Hannah agreed, but she was smiling as she rocked their daughter. James was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to help take care of her. He would bring her toys, sing to her when she cried, and proudly announce to anyone who would listen that he was a big brother. It made Hannah's heart swell to see him so gentle and caring with Margaret. The ranch continued to prosper and grow. By 1885, the McAllister spread was one of the most successful in the territory, with a herd of over 500 head of cattle and a reputation for quality beef. They had hired 3 additional hands to help with the work, and had built a new barn and expanded the house to accommodate their growing family. Hannah sometimes could barely recognize the frightened woman who had collapsed on that hill 7 years ago. She was confident now, sure of her place in the world, secure in the love of her husband and family. She had everything she had ever wanted, and some things she had not even known to dream of. They celebrated their 7th anniversary on the hill behind the house, the same hill where everything had begun. Thomas had surprised her by arranging for Daniel to watch the children so they could have an evening alone together. 7 years, Hannah marveled as they lay in the grass watching the stars emerge. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. "You remember what I said to you that first night up here?" Thomas asked, "when we confessed how we felt about each other." "You said I was like the stars," Hannah recalled, her voice soft with the memory, "bright and beautiful and constant." "I said you were my brightest star," Thomas corrected, turning to face her. "And I meant it then and I mean it now. You are the light that guides me home, Hannah. The constant in my life that makes everything else make sense." Hannah felt tears well up, the good kind that came from happiness too big to contain. "You are my constant too, my home, my everything." Thomas leaned over and kissed her, sweet and tender, and Hannah closed her eyes and lost herself in the moment. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging, bearing witness to a love that had started with desperation and grown into something deep and lasting. James started school that fall, riding into Parowan with Thomas 3 days a week to attend the small schoolhouse there. He was bright and eager to learn, coming home full of stories about his teacher and his lessons. Margaret, now a year old and walking everywhere, missed her brother terribly on school days and would light up with joy when he returned home. The following spring brought tragedy when Daniel announced he had met a woman in Parowan and planned to marry her. It was not the marriage that was tragic, but the fact that it meant he would be leaving the ranch to start his own life. "I am not going far," Daniel assured them as they sat around the kitchen table discussing his plans. "Just a few miles down the valley. We will still see each other all the time. And I will still help with the ranch when you need me." "I am happy for you," Thomas said, and he meant it even though Hannah could see the sadness in his eyes at the thought of his brother leaving. "You deserve to build your own family, your own life." Daniel's wife turned out to be a lovely woman named Sarah, a schoolteacher with a quick smile and a kind heart. The wedding was held in June, with James serving as ring bearer and Margaret as flower girl, though she mostly just threw the petals at people rather than scattering them on the ground. After Daniel moved out, the house felt strangely empty, even though they still had 2 young children filling it with noise and laughter. Hannah knew Thomas missed his brother's daily presence, the easy camaraderie of working side by side. But they adapted as they always did, and life went on. Hannah gave birth to their 3rd child in the spring of 1888, another boy they named Robert. He was a quiet baby, content to lie in his cradle and watch the world with solemn eyes. James, now 7, was thrilled to have a brother, while Margaret at 3 was less impressed with another baby taking attention away from her. "Why do we need another one?" Margaret demanded. "I liked it better when it was just me." "You will love him once he gets bigger and can play with you," Hannah assured her, though privately she thought Margaret's jealous phase might last a while. The 1890s brought changes to the territory and to their family. Utah was on the verge of statehood, with all the political upheaval and excitement that entailed. The railroad had reached Parowan, making it easier to ship cattle to market and bringing more people and business to the area. The McAllister Ranch adapted with the times, always staying ahead of the curve thanks to Hannah's business acumen and Thomas's willingness to try new methods. Their children grew like weeds in the summer sun. James became a skilled horseman and a natural leader, often helping Thomas manage the ranch hands. Margaret developed a talent for drawing and could often be found sketching the landscape or the cattle. Robert, quiet and thoughtful, loved books and learning, and announced at age 8 that he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. "A doctor," Thomas repeated, impressed. "That is a noble ambition, son." "Someone has to take care of people," Robert said seriously. "And I like figuring out how things work." Hannah gave birth to their fourth and final child in 1893, a daughter they named Elizabeth. She was a surprise, coming when Hannah was nearly 40 and had assumed her child-bearing years were behind her. But Elizabeth was a joyful surprise, a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed to find everything in life delightful. "She is our bonus baby," Thomas said, cuddling the infant close. "Our unexpected blessing." "I am too old for this," Hannah protested, but she was smiling as she said it. "You are perfect," Thomas countered, "and Elizabeth is perfect. We are a family of 6 now, our house is full and our life is complete." He was right. The house was constantly alive with noise and activity, children running in and out, the sound of laughter and occasional arguments, the organized chaos of a large family. Hannah loved every exhausting, wonderful moment of it. The children grew and changed, developing into full individuals with their own dreams and personalities. James decided he wanted to run the ranch someday, taking over from Thomas when the time came. Margaret shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to move to Salt Lake City and study art at the new university there. Robert maintained his goal of becoming a doctor, studying voraciously and apprenticing with the doctor in Parowan when he was old enough. And Elizabeth, the baby, declared she wanted to be a teacher like Aunt Sarah. "They are all going to leave us someday," Hannah said one evening as she and Thomas sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley. "Go off and live their own lives." "That is what we raised them to do," Thomas pointed out, "to be independent and strong and capable of building their own futures. We did our job well." "I know," Hannah said, "but I will miss them." "So will I," Thomas agreed, taking her hand, "but we will always have each other." That has never changed. And it had not. Through 20 years of marriage, 4 children, the inevitable struggles and triumphs of building a life together, Thomas and Hannah's love had remained constant. They still made time for each other, still took walks under the stars, still found ways to make each other laugh. The passion of their early days had matured into something deeper and more enduring, a partnership built on respect and trust and genuine affection. Utah became a state in 1896, and the McAllister family celebrated with the rest of the territory. They attended the statehood party in Parowan, the children wide-eyed at the fireworks and festivities. Hannah stood with Thomas's arm around her waist and felt profound gratitude for the life they had built, for the family they had created, for the love that had sustained them through everything. 20 years, she said softly, though their anniversary was still months away. "Best 20 years of my life," Thomas replied immediately. The turn of the century came, bringing with it a new millennium and all the hope and uncertainty that entailed. James, now 20, officially took over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, though Thomas still helped and advised. Margaret had indeed gone to Salt Lake City to study art and was making a name for herself with her landscape paintings. Robert was in medical school, on his way to becoming the doctor he had always wanted to be. And Elizabeth, at 7, was the heart of the house, keeping Hannah and Thomas young with her endless energy. Daniel and Sarah had 4 children of their own now, and the 2 families remained close, gathering for holidays and celebrations. The cousins were inseparable, a rambunctious group that brought chaos and joy wherever they went. On a warm evening in the summer of 1900, Hannah and Thomas climbed the hill behind the house, as they had done so many times over the years. Elizabeth was staying with Daniel and Sarah for the night, and the older children were all pursuing their own activities, leaving them alone together for a rare, quiet evening. They lay in the grass and watched the stars emerge, the familiar constellations taking their places in the vast expanse above. Hannah rested her head on Thomas's shoulder and felt completely at peace. "You remember what I said to you that first night we lay here?" Thomas asked. "After you agreed to stay, after I asked you to let me court you, you called me your brightest star," Hannah said, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. "I did," Thomas confirmed. "And you know what? After 22 years of marriage, after 4 children and a lifetime of building this ranch together, you still are. You are still the brightest thing in my sky, Hannah McAllister. The star that guides me home." Hannah turned to kiss him, her eyes wet with happy tears. "And you are mine. You always have been, from that very first night when you found me on this hill, scared and alone and running for my life. You saved me, Thomas. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Thomas corrected gently. "You gave me purpose, a reason to build something that mattered. You gave me a family and a future. Everything good in my life traces back to the night I found you stargazing on this hill." They lay together in the grass, watching the stars and talking softly about the past and the future. They talked about James's plans for the ranch, about Margaret's upcoming art exhibition in Salt Lake City, about Robert's graduation from medical school next year, about Elizabeth's latest adventure at school. They talked about growing old together, about grandchildren they would someday have, about the legacy they were building not just in land and cattle but in the lives of their children. "I want to grow old with you on this ranch," Hannah said. "I want to watch our grandchildren play in this valley. I want to spend every night for the rest of my life looking at the stars with you." "That sounds perfect to me," Thomas said, pulling her closer. "That sounds like exactly the life I want, and it was the life they got." James married a sweet girl named Rachel 2 years later, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch property. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after his grandfather, was born in 1903, followed by 3 more children over the next 6 years. James took over the ranch completely when Thomas turned 60, allowing the older man to finally slow down and enjoy his grandchildren. Margaret married an artist she met in Salt Lake City and divided her time between there and Parowan, always coming home for holidays and bringing new paintings to hang on the walls of the ranch house. Robert became a doctor and opened a practice in Parowan, where he was beloved by his patients for his skill and compassion. Elizabeth became a teacher, just as she had planned, and eventually married one of her fellow teachers and had children of her own. Through it all, Thomas and Hannah remained the steady center of their expanding family. They were the grandparents who always had time for a story or a hug, who could be counted on for wisdom and support, who showed through their own example what a strong marriage looked like. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were children and grandchildren everywhere, the house bursting with noise and laughter and love. Hannah, now 63 but still strong and capable, looked around at the chaos and felt her heart swell with gratitude. "We did good," Thomas said, coming up beside her and slipping an arm around her waist. He was 65 now, his hair completely gray and his movements slower, but his eyes were still bright when he looked at her. "We did very good," Hannah agreed, leaning into him. "Better than I ever imagined that night on the hill when you found me. You want to go up there tonight?" Thomas asked. "After everyone leaves, Just the two of us and the stars." "I would love that," Hannah said. That evening, after the guests had departed and the house was quiet, Thomas and Hannah climbed the hill one more time. It was harder now than it had been when they were young, their joints stiff and their breathing labored, but they made it to the top and sat down in their favorite spot. The stars blazed overhead, ancient and constant, exactly as they had been 40 years ago when two strangers had become something more. 40 years, Hannah marveled. 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories. "And I would do it all again," Thomas said, taking her hand. "Every single moment, every challenge, every triumph, as long as it was with you. Even the part where I was running for my life and collapsed on your land half dead," Hannah asked with a slight smile. "Especially that part," Thomas said, "because that was the night I found my brightest star." They sat together under the vast Utah sky, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had lasted a lifetime. The ranch spread out below them, the land they had worked and nurtured for 40 years, the legacy they would pass on to their children and grandchildren. The house where they had raised their family glowed with lamplight, a beacon of home and warmth in the darkness. And above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, bearing witness to a love story that had started with desperation and grown into something beautiful and enduring. Hannah looked up at those stars and thought of her father, who had taught her to find the constellations all those years ago. She thought of her younger self, frightened and alone, running through the desert with no hope and no future. She thought of Thomas laying down beside her that first night, offering water and kindness to a stranger. She thought of his voice saying, "You are my brightest star," and how those words had changed everything. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked softly. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best ones," Hannah said. "About how grateful I am that I ran in this direction, that I collapsed on this particular hill, that you were the one who found me." "I am grateful too," Thomas said. "Every single day I thank God that I went walking that night, that I saw you lying there, that I had the sense to bring you home." "Home," Hannah repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, that is exactly what this is. You gave me a home, Thomas, not just a place to live, but a place to belong. A family to love and be loved by. A life worth living." "You gave me the same thing," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I had the land and the work, but I did not have a real home until you came into my life. You and our children, our family, that is what makes this place home." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Hannah made a wish, the same wish she had made countless times over the years, that this love, this life, this family would endure. "You think they will remember us?" Hannah asked after a while. "Our grandchildren, their children, will they know our story?" "I think so," Thomas said. "I think they will tell it around campfires and kitchen tables, the story of how their grandmother was running for her life and found refuge on a ranch in Utah. How she and their grandfather fell in love under the stars, how they built something lasting together." "I hope they do," Hannah said. "I hope they understand that love is not always easy, but it is always worth fighting for. That family is the most important thing we can build in this life." "They will understand," Thomas assured her, "because we showed them. Every day, through our actions and our choices, we showed them what love looks like." As the night deepened and the air grew cool, Thomas helped Hannah to her feet, and they made their way slowly down the hill toward the glowing house below. Their steps were slower now than they had been 40 years ago, but they were steady, each supporting the other, a partnership that had only grown stronger with time. Hannah paused at the bottom of the hill and looked back up at the crest, remembering the frightened young woman who had hidden behind the scrub oak, certain she was going to die. She thought about all the years that had passed since then, all the joy and sorrow and ordinary moments that had woven together to create a life. "Thank you," she said softly, not sure if she was talking to Thomas or to fate or to God or to all three at once. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For everything," Hannah said simply. "For being you, for loving me, for building this life with me." Thomas pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "The pleasure has been all mine, Hannah McAllister. You are my brightest star today and always." They walked into the house hand in hand, closing the door on the starlit night, but taking the memory of it with them. And in the years that followed, as they grew older and their family continued to expand, they never stopped climbing that hill together whenever they could, never stopped lying in the grass and watching the stars, never stopped being grateful for the night that had brought them together. Hannah lived to see her children's children grow up and have children of their own. She lived to see the ranch prosper and expand, to see her family tree branch out across the territory and beyond. And through it all, Thomas was beside her, her constant and her home, the man who had found her on a hill and called her his brightest star. When Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1928 at the age of 74, Hannah grieved deeply, but took comfort in the fact that they had been given 50 years together, 5 decades of love and partnership, and building a life. She lived 2 more years without him, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, passing on the stories and wisdom of a life well lived. On a warm night in September of 1930, just days before what would have been their 52nd anniversary, Hannah asked her grandson Thomas to help her climb the hill one last time. He did so carefully, supporting her frail frame, and settled her gently in the grass where she had spent so many nights with his grandfather. "Tell me about the stars, Grandma," young Thomas said, sitting beside her. Hannah looked up at the familiar constellations and smiled. "See that bright one there? That is the North Star, the one that never moves. Your great-grandfather taught me to find it when I was just a little girl. And that cluster there is the Pleiades, the 7 sisters. Your grandfather and I used to lie right here and look at them together." "Grandpa really called you his brightest star?" the boy asked, having heard the story many times but never tiring of it. "He did," Hannah confirmed, her voice soft with memory. "The first night we spent time together on this hill after I agreed to stay and let him court me, he told me I was like the stars, bright and beautiful and constant. He said I was his brightest star, and do you know what? He kept saying it, right up until the end. Even when we were old and gray, he would still look at me and call me his brightest star." "That is the most romantic thing I ever heard," young Thomas said. "It was," Hannah agreed. "Your grandfather was a good man, the best man I ever knew. And we had a good life together, a life full of love and family and purpose. That is all anyone can ask for, really." She was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars, and then she said softly, "I think I am ready to go find him now." "Grandma," young Thomas said, suddenly concerned. "It is all right, sweetheart," Hannah assured him, patting his hand. "I have lived a long, full life. I have seen my children grow and prosper, have held my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. I have done everything I set out to do. Now I am ready to rest, to be with your grandfather again." "Should I get someone?" the boy asked, frightened. "Just stay with me," Hannah said. "Keep me company while I watch the stars one last time." Young Thomas held his grandmother's hand and sat with her under the vast Utah sky, watching as her breathing gradually slowed and her eyes grew distant. And when Hannah Olsen McAllister took her last breath, it was with a smile on her face and her eyes on the stars, joining the man who had called her his brightest star and loved her for 50 years. The family buried her next to Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land, and the family they had built together. And for generations afterward, the story was told and retold, passed down from parents to children. The story of a woman running for her life who found refuge on a ranch in Utah, and the cowboy who lay beside her under the stars and called her his brightest one. It became a legend in the family, a reminder that love can bloom in the darkest moments, that sometimes the worst days of our lives lead to the best ones, that family and devotion are the most important things we can build in this world. The ranch continued to prosper under James's stewardship, and later under his sons, remaining in the McAllister family for generations. And on clear nights, when the stars blazed bright over the Utah desert, someone from the family could always be found climbing that hill, lying in the grass where Thomas and Hannah had spent so many nights together, looking up at the wheeling constellations and remembering the love story that had started it all. Because some love stories, like the stars themselves, are constant and enduring, blazing bright across the years and lighting the way for those who come after. And the love between Hannah and Thomas McAllister was exactly that kind of story, a brightest star that never faded, a light that continued to guide their family home, generation after generation, under the vast and beautiful Utah sky.